How did an ordinary boy, a son of a farmer, manage to become one of the richest and most famous people in the world and started a company with an annual revenue of $158 billion? He turned the industry upside down and made automobiles affordable for the middle class, the employer with the highest wages for workers, and one of those to whom we owe a 5-day work week. A contradictory personality with great merits on the one hand and great shortcomings on the other, Henry Ford is the founder of the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford was born in Springwells, Michigan on July 30 in 1863 to William Ford and Mary Lilligott Ford. His father moved to America from Ireland in 1847. For most of his life, he worked on a farm where he grew grain and kept livestock, and was also engaged in logging. The family was large. In addition to Henry, there were 2 more girls and 3 boys in the family. In general, the father of the family planned that he would leave the farm to Henry as a legacy, and he would take his place in old age. But Henry didn't show much love for agriculture. Instead, he really began to show interest in mechanics and took up the independent study of various designs and principles of operations of equipment. When Henry was only 12, he spent most of his free time in a small mechanical workshop, which he equipped all by himself. Then 2 magic events occurred. It all started with William giving his son a pocket watch. Henry studied their construction inside and out and was soon repairing the watch movements of friends and neighbors. The second highlight was an introduction to the principle of operation of the heat engine Nichols and Shepard in action. Henry and his father were driving back from the city in a cart when they met a huge, steam-shorted self-propelled car. Henry was so carried away by this idea that when he returned home, he undertook to design a steam engine. When Henry was 13, his mother Mary died suddenly. Henry was very upset by the loss and, in order to somehow distract himself, plunged headlong into work on his first steam engine. 2 years later, in his workshop on a farm, the young inventor created a steam car. But after thinking it over, he decided that steam wasn't suitable for light vehicles since the boiler was dangerous. Very dangerous. His father still made several more attempts to pursue his son to continue the family business on the farm, but Henry didn't have much love for working there, and schooling was also not very exciting for him. He studied mediocrely and barely graduating from secondary school. At the age of 15, young Henry Ford left school and didn't continue his formal education at university. So it can be said with confidence that he acquired the basic knowledge and skills in the automotive industry already in practice, and in the process of self-education, school had nothing to do with it whatsoever. A year later, Henry left home and went to Detroit to the Detroit Dry Dock Company, where he was accepted as an apprentice mechanist. So he was already free to install and repair various engines. Sometime later, Henry's father, William Ford, made one last attempt to bring his son back to the family business. William offered his son land for construction, and he unexpectedly agreed. Perhaps the reason was that Henry met a girl? She was the charming Clara Jane Bryan from a family of farmers. Henry decided to marry and decided to take the advantage of the moment, since the girl's parents were pious and strict people and of course wouldn't have given her for a young man without a penny for his soul, without land or house, one way or another. Hustily building a cozy house on his farm, Henry settled in it with his young wife and for the first time after the wedding, supported by his family by farming and managing his father's sawmill. But his passion didn't just disappear. While living on a farm, he began to work on a 2-cylinder engine. He successfully sold the patent for this invention to the famous American inventor and entrepreneur Thomas Edison, after which he invited Henry to his company in Detroit, where Henry rose to the rank of chief engineer in just 2 years. All this is good, but he was still most attracted to cars, or I would rather call them vehicles. So meanwhile, Ford was working on the invention of the horseless carriage. Quite a busy man was Henry Ford. In 1893, Henry and Clara had a son, Edsel. At the same time, in fact, Ford's career as a car manufacturer began. He already had enough time and money to start experimenting with the creation of the gasoline engine. The first single-cylinder engine was created right on the kitchen table of Ford's house in Detroit, and the first car was a frame equipped with just 4 bicycle wheels. He called his first vehicle a quadricycle. Henry quit Thomas Edison Company and spent a year testing his invention, so he drove over 1,000 miles in a quadricycle while working on the creation of a second car. Supported by William Murphy, a Detroit timber merchant, on August 5, in 1899, he founded the Detroit Automobile Company and took up the design and construction of racing cars. In 1901, 38-year-old Henry challenged the most famous racing driver of the time, Alexander Winter. At the track at Goose Point, he won the race driving his car sweepstakes, beating Winton by almost a mile. It was difficult to come up with a better PR company, and Ford himself, even then more than anyone else, could understand the importance of advertising. By the way, the Ford logo was created in the same year by Childy Harold Wills, and the trademark itself was registered 6 years later. With the success of Ford's racing car, William Murphy and other shareholders of the Detroit Automobile Company founded the Henry Ford Company a month later, with Ford himself as a chief engineer, but soon they decided to invite an engineer, Henry Leland, as a consultant. Perhaps Henry Ford was offended by this move. It's hard to say, but in the end, he quarreled with the shareholders so much that he left the company that bears his name. And after Ford left, the same Leland renamed the company to Cadillac. And Henry Ford had a thing on Leland, but I'll tell you about this a little later. After leaving the company, Henry Ford took up the design of a new car and turned to an acquaintance called dealer Alexander Malcolmson with a request to help finance a new company. Malcolmson agreed and not only invested money, but also invited the famous banker and businessman John Gray to the team, whose name and authority quickly attracted other investors. Henry Ford and 12 others invested a total of $28,000 and distributed 1,000 shares among themselves. In total, Ford and Malcolmson received 51% of the shares, half of which belonged to Ford. So in 1903, the Ford Motor Company was registered. John Gray was elected president, and Henry Ford became vice president and general manager. In July of the same year, the first car created by the company was sold. The company got off to a decent start. In less than half a year, the company's profit was almost $37,000, and 2 years later, the total profit was almost $300,000. So in just 2 years, dividends brought investors a profit of almost 300%. However, there were also internal frictions in the company. The issue came to head when major shareholders, Ford and Malcolmson, had a fight over the future direction of the company. Company president John Gray sided with Henry Ford, and by early 1906, Malcolmson was effectively removed from the company and soon sold his shares to Henry Ford. That same year, John Gray died unexpectedly, and Ford himself took over as president of the Ford Motor Company. I know it sounds like it all happened within a day. Of course, it was going on for a while, but you got the idea. Everything just happened, so Ford owned and ruled his company now. In the early years of its existence, the company produced a line of cars from A, in alphabetic order, to the real sensation was made by the Model T, nicknamed Tin Lizzie. Released in 1908, this car was very easy to drive, and its cost was $825, which at that time was considered expensive. But the price fell every year. For example, in 1913, the car cost $550, and in 11 years, it was only $260. Henry Ford created a quality and affordable product for hundreds of thousands of average Americans. The success exceeded all expectations. Over the entire period of production of the T model, over 15 million cars were sold. From 1911, the company began to expand rapidly overseas, gradually opening assembly plants and buying factories in Ireland, England, France, and Denmark. Ford invested in the purchase of mines, coal mines, and everything that is required to produce cars. So he created an entire empire independent of foreign trade. The company also had many dealers. Franchises grew rich and popularized not only Ford, but the concept of the automotive industry as a whole. Another significant invention of that time is the revolutionary development and implementation of moving conveyor belts at Ford factories. Initially, it took about 14 hours to assemble one Model T car, and with the introduction of a conveyor belt into production, the assembly time was reduced to 1 hour 33 minutes. This allowed Ford to increase production to 202,667 units per year. Production grew, sales skyrocketed. Car production in 1914 reached 308,000 units, and in 1915, 52-year-old Ford had already produced over 500,000 cars. Henry Ford was also a pioneer of social capitalism. His dream was to improve hiring, retain, and stimulate the best employees. He believed that staff turnover and the work of slow employees were the main cause of production delays and additional costs for any company. So in January 1914, he solved this problem in a very original way, doubling the wages of workers from $2.34 to $5 a day, which was more than double the average wage, and reducing shifts from 9 hours to 8. These innovations caused unprecedented stir among competitors. After all, now even an ordinary Ford factory worker could buy a car in less than 4 months. Also, Henry Ford introduced a recruiting practice in the company that identified the best workers, including disabled people who were considered out of the working league at that time. Another interesting strategy was raising the wages of productive employees with a good reputation. Are you thinking, what did they have to do to get a raise? Work in the company for 6 or more months and be a worthy, decent person. Ideas about a decent lifestyle were prescribed in accordance with the standards of Ford's social department, which numbered 50 people, and fought against parasitism, drunkenness, gambling, and those who are now called defaulting fathers. Also, Henry Ford in those years wrote a book on smoking cessation, in which he raised the topic of the dangers of smoking cigarettes. He confirmed his reasoning with studies of the scientific luminaries of the time, and this, remember, in 1914, at a time when people smoked freely on trams and in restaurants, and smoking was not even associated with health problems. Eventually, Ford's intrusion in the private lives of his employees was perceived by them as so controversial that he soon abandoned the most intrusive aspects of it. But he achieved his goal. Staff turnover fell, productivity increased, and most importantly, buying a car has become available to most ordinary American citizens. At the start of World War I, Ford believed that war was a wasteful folly that slowed down long-term economic growth. He also argued that munition manufacturers liked wars, but most businesses would like to be in the business of making and selling useful goods and making steady long-term profits, not fighting. At first, he supported organizations that opposed military intervention and was critical of those who, in his opinion, financed the war, and even tried to stop them. So in 1915, he agreed to finance the sending of the peace ship to Europe, where the First World War was raging, and even joined 170 peace activists. But according to one version, he himself became the object of numerous radicals and was forced to leave the ship as soon as it reached Sweden. Anyways, when the US ended the war in 1917, Ford fell silent on foreign policy issues, and his company became a major supplier of engines for warplanes and anti-submarine boats, forts and tractors, and trucks to boost food supplies. What happened to those strong beliefs now? I honestly don't know. Maybe Ford realized the potential for his company, or maybe he just got angry? Like other automobile companies, Ford entered the aviation business during World War I, building the Liberty engine. Ford's most successful aircraft was the Ford 480 Trimeter, often referred to as the Dingus due to its corrugated metal construction. The 12-passenger Trimeter first flew in the summer of 1926 and was the first successful passenger airline in the United States. Henry Ford was 63 years old. Well, immediately after the end of the First World War, Henry Ford handed over the presidency of the Ford Motor Company to his 25-year-old son Edsel Ford, but since he still retained the right to make final decisions, he sometimes canceled his son's decisions. Ford, already a professional businessman, was determined to have complete control over strategic decisions. He soon founded another company, Henry Ford & Son, and put on a show by taking himself and his best employees into the new company. Why did he do it? To scare the remaining discerning shareholders of the Ford Motor Company into selling their shares before they lose most of their value. This show worked. Eventually, Henry Ford, his wife Clara, and son Edsel bought all the remaining shares from other investors for just under $106 million, thus giving the family sole ownership of the $125 million company. At that time, Ford was already producing 50% of all cars in the US and 40% in the UK, and car production exceeded 1 million units a year. Henry Ford showed relatively little enthusiasm for luxury cars. He didn't seek to bring Ford into the premium segment, but 2 years later, he suddenly decided to acquire the luxury car manufacturer, Lincoln Motor Company. And from whom? From the same Henry Leland, after whose arrival 20 years ago, Henry Ford was forced to leave his first company. How did Ford get even with Leland? Leland founded the company in 1917 and really loved his cars. By acquiring Lincoln, the insidious Ford briefly allowed Leland and his son Wilfred to run their company, but they both were soon driven out of it with a bang. In 1924, a new Ford plant was opened in South Africa, and a year later, several plants in Germany, Austria, Argentina, Australia, and Japan were opened at once. 2 years later, Ford continued his factory-wide social reforms, and in addition to raising the wages of his workers, he introduced a shorter 5-day work week, as he believed that workers grateful for the extra rest would put in more effort. But in spite of all of this, Ford was vehemently against unions, believing that union leaders, despite their supposedly good motives, had the incentive to stir up permanent socioeconomic divisions and stir up problems to maintain their power, and they ultimately bring more harm than good. It is interesting that Howard Schultz, whom I have already talked about on my channel, shared this opinion. Car prices were kept low by high production volumes, but over time, Ford began to steadily lose market shares to General Motors and Chrysler. And all because competitors began to produce cars with innovative features and luxurious options, while Henry Ford didn't bring anything new to the configuration of his cars. Also, competition began to provide loans to customers for the purchase of expensive cars with monthly payments. Henry Ford resisted this approach, insisting that pushing people into debt would ultimately hurt both the consumer and the economy. But progress was unstoppable, and in the end, Ford relented and began to offer the same conditions. Although Ford fancied himself an engineering genius, he had little formal education in mechanical engineering. By 1926, declining Model T sales finally convinced him of the need for a new model. He retired the Model T and took over the development of the Model A with a new engine and chassis, leaving body design to his son. The new Ford Model A was introduced to the market a year later and produced 1 million cars a year until 1931, after which Ford introduced the concept of an annual model change. While in the 30s, Ford, like other manufacturers around the world, suffered from the Great Depression. The drop in sales caused the closure of shops and the reduction in the sales of production. This was followed by the inevitable dismissal of workers. Did you know that by 1932, Detroit's unemployment rate had risen to 30% and thousands of families were facing real hardship? Crowds of dismissed workers took to the streets in indignation. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Henry Ford's son Edsel, who was president of the company, believed that his father should negotiate a collective bargaining agreement with the unions. But Ford, who still had the ultimate veto power in the company, refused to cooperate. To prevent any harmful activity, Henry Ford appointed Harry Bennett, a former Navy boxer, as the head of the social department. Harry Bennett used various intimidation tactics to stifle union organizing, but this only led to the Detroit Unemployment Board organizing a hunger march. On March 7, in 1932, about 5,000 unemployed people gathered in West Detroit to march to the factory and make demands on Henry Ford himself. The process took on a terrible character. The police fired tear gas at the crowd and attempted to disperse the protesters with ice-cold water from the fire engines. The protesters responded by throwing stones. Violence escalated rapidly and culminated with the Dearborn Police Department and Ford guards opening live fire through the factory gate at unarmed protesters, killing 4 men on the spot and a 5th dying later in hospital. Another 60 people were seriously injured. Another episode occurred 5 years later when in May 1937, Harry Bennett's guards beat members of the automobile union with batons. In the run-up to World War II, Henry Ford read that Franklin Roosevelt was deliberately pushing the U.S. closer to war. Until December 1941, the U.S. remained neutral, and Ford didn't interfere. Ford's position was, to put it mildly, contradictory, and although Henry Ford himself insisted that the war was the product of greedy financiers seeking profit and the destruction of people, he was no less worried that under the decree of Adolf Hitler, his factories in Germany could be nationalized. He established in advance close cooperation with Germany before the war, so close in fact that in July 1938, Ford received the Order of the German Eagle from the regime for his significant contribution to the build-up of the German armed forces. It should also be noted that during the Second World War, Henry Ford himself attracted attention for his anti-Semitic views and public statements. His authoritarian views and propaganda drew criticism from some American public figures and Jewish organizations. Only after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into the war, Ford agreed to take part in the production of military equipment and entered into the U.S. and Allied military order program. In 1943, at the age of 49, Henry Ford's son Edsel died of stomach cancer. And an octogenarian old man suffering from heart problems and atherosclerosis decided to take over the company again. But this seems to others not a very good idea. After the loss of his son, he became unstable, suspicious, and his mental state was questionable. So there was a very real possibility that the company would collapse after his death. The company began to decline, losing over $10 million a month. Most board directors didn't want Henry Ford to be president. Even the administration of US President Franklin Roosevelt considered the possibility of a state takeover of the company to expand military production. Given the serious risk of bankruptcy, Henry Ford's wife Clara and Nathal's widow Eleanor opposed him and demanded that he transfer control of the company to his grandson, Henry Ford II. They threatened to sell their shares, which compromised 3/4 of the company's total shares if he refused. Henry Ford was furious, but couldn't help it and gave up. What a drama! In September 1945, he resigned for the second time as president and recommended to the board that his grandson, Henry Ford II, be elected to the post. The board of directors agreed and Henry Ford II took over. Tellingly, as his first business move, Henry Ford II fired the same Navy boxer Harry Bennett, who had suppressed Union protests with weapons in the 30s of the Great Depression. On April 7, in 1947, at the age of 83, the Ford founder died of cerebral hemorrhage at his Fairline estate in Dearborn and was buried in Ford Cemetery in Detroit. His wife Clara Bryant died 3 years later. After the death of Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company became one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world. For several decades, the company continued to develop under the leadership of Henry Ford II. In the 50s and 60s, the company introduced cars that became the legend of the American automobile industry, such as the Ford Thunderbird and the Ford Mustang. The company also actively expanded outside the United States. So in the 1950s, Ford produced cars in factories in Europe, South America, and Asia, which allowed Ford to threaten its positions as an international automobile manufacturer. Today, Ford Motor Company continues to evolve and adapt to changing market demands. The Ford model range includes not only cars but also trucks, crossovers, racing, and sport cars. The company is also actively investing in research to create more efficient and environmentally sustainable technologies and is working on the development and deployment of self-driving and autonomous electric vehicles. The company has 173,000 employees and a turnover of $158 billion US. Henry Ford was a prolific inventor and received 161 US patents. He once said, "Failure is just an opportunity to start again, but more wisely." Keep up learning, guys. Success is just the number of attempts.